My name is James Dallas. I'm the treasurer of the Maury County Democratic Party. I'm also an amateur historian, and I am going to be a poll worker as well tomorrow on August 6th. That's a Thursday. Now, in most parts of the country, elections are always on Tuesday. So, why do we do things on Thursdays here in Tennessee? Well, despite being born here, I did not spend most of my adult life in Tennessee. I spent most of my adult life in Texas. All of our elections were either on Tuesdays or Saturdays. So when I moved here, I found it very strange that we would have election day on a Thursday. But there's actually a good reason, and it goes back all the way to the beginning of Tennessee as a state. In the Constitution of 1796, which was our state's first constitution, the framers of that document decided that Thursday was the best day to have elections, and they scheduled the first election for a Thursday in March, followed every year thereafter for a Thursday, the first Thursday in August. Now, of course, they wanted to pick a day that was in the middle of the week because most people were farmers. They didn't work in offices or shops. So they didn't have to worry about, the weekend and the weekdays. They mostly just wanted to make sure that people could get back to their home or the area around their home so that they could go to church on Sunday. There were not many Jewish or Muslim folks, so I doubt that they were intentionally trying to avoid Saturday or Friday so much as making sure that people had enough time to travel from the polling site back home so that they could be there for the Sabbath. Now, turnout was pretty good back in the day. Pretty much, well, turnout was good if you assume that turnout is measured versus the number of people who can vote. So, of course, the people who could vote back there then were men who had the money to pay the poll tax. And after 1834, that was only white men. There was a brief period of time, actually, in Tennessee history when, before the 15th Amendment, when people of color could vote if they weren't slaves, but that was more of a loophole than really an intentional thing. So of course, because turnout was a big deal, they wanted to make sure there wasn't a conflict between church and voting. Keep in mind, this was the horse and buggy days, but most people didn't even have horses and buggies. Not everyone even had a horse, so a lot of people had to walk, and there was usually only one polling site per civil district, at least after civil districts were created. So there were only a handful of polling places in the entire county, and counties back then were often larger than they are today. So they had to walk, or at least had to be able to walk home in 2 or 3 days. So, of course, that was going to make it either like a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Most states, for reasons, decided on Tuesday, but there was no federal standard at that time as to which day to pick. And so they ended up picking the first Thursday in August in odd years, which is kind of strange. You might think, well, doesn't Congress have to be elected in even years? And the answer is no, not really. If you read the Constitution carefully, it simply says every other year. It doesn't say odd or even, it just says every other year. So different states had different election days and sometimes different election months and different election years. Presidential elections were standardized for November in even years as early as 1845 by federal statute, but it wasn't until the 1870s that the federal government mandated that Congress be elected on a Tuesday in November. So Tennessee kept doing its big elections on the first Thursday in August. And it wasn't just congressional elections. It wasn't just state rep and state senate. It was also the gubernatorial election. And when you got to the Civil War, the Confederate Constitution was ratified by Tennessee on August 1st, 1861, again in keeping with that philosophy of having the election on the first Thursday in August. It wasn't until 1870, when the state constitution was rewritten after the Civil War, that the general election for members of the United States House, the General Assembly, and Governor of Tennessee was moved to November the Tuesday in November that we elect our president, instead of August. Of course, we didn't vote for U.S. Senator at that time. That didn't happen until the 17th Amendment was passed. And we didn't have presidential or any primaries, really. All candidates were nominated by convention at that point. But it was after 1870 when November became the day that Tennesseans thought of as election day, and August became sort of the secondary date for local elections. We have this weird tradition of voting on Thursdays. It goes back to our beginnings as a state. And even though we don't have the general election, at least not for the bigger offices, we do for the local offices. We've kept this tradition for the state primary primarily. So keep that in mind when you vote. That it's part of a very ancient tradition. It's something that Tennesseans apparently are quite proud of, and so consider yourself lucky to be part of that. Also, tomorrow, make sure that you wear a mask if you have one. As a poll worker, I will appreciate it. We're going to be wearing masks and taking care of ourselves. Keep in mind, it's a weird election tomorrow because of the pandemic. Not the weirdest, not the biggest crisis we've ever had as a state, but there's a lot of weird history in Tennessee politics, and maybe in future videos I'll cover more of those. So, anyways, have a good night. Please vote tomorrow. Please take care of yourselves, and God bless.